Okay, I think we'll begin. So welcome to the, excuse me, Saturday night class series. My name is Bruce Director. I think most people know me, and we're joined tonight by Ben Deniston, who some of you probably know. He plays an essential role in LaRouche PAC, and he also was one of the key figures who worked directly with Lyndon LaRouche in the so-called basement team, which was the team of young science thinkers that LaRouche put together in the 2000s and 2000 teens to actually develop and further elaborate LaRouche's ideas on economic science. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I think a lot of people are getting the sense, especially those of you who have been out organizing, that there's a really dramatic shift going on in the country towards a breakout away from the Biden collective, and which likely will result in a Republican Congress, certainly a Republican House, if not also a Republican Senate and Republican governorships. We might get some reports about this over the course of the discussion tonight on the ground, but people have pretty much had it with what Biden is doing. And really, I would credit the activity of President Trump in rallying his MAGA base, which is still expanding around the America First agenda, but and most importantly, to really take back America and restore America to economic prosperity, especially in the face of the disaster that's been brought upon us by the Biden administration. Now, we very much desire that result. And I think most of us are working hard to make sure that especially the Trump endorsed candidates get elected in the upcoming election. But that is not really the ultimate goal. That's just sort of a necessary step, because we are we are living through a real dramatic shift in the world economy, but especially in the US economy. And of course, some of this has to do with, financial matters, which is what most people think about when they think about the economy, which brings into play things like, the Fed's policies and the collapse of the dollar and the rise of the dollar, collapse of the value of the dollar in the United States, the rise relative to other currencies, which really just signifies that the US dollar is not collapsing as fast as other currencies are in value. But there's the real issue is the physical economic crisis. And some of this has very much been going on for some time, but it's been very much exacerbated by the policies of the Biden administration, most emphatically the crazy policy of sanctions against Russia and Biden's refusal to do anything to stop this war in Ukraine. As President Trump said, the war never would have happened had he been president, and were he, and even he offered himself, he said it has to be brought to an end now. We have to have a peace discussion, and he offered himself up to negotiate it, which I think would be a great idea, but I doubt that's anything Biden would go along with. Nevertheless, the continuation of these sanctions and this war is just accelerating the physical economic collapse. Many of you have heard the stories of what's going on in Europe, factories shutting down and so forth. And of course, we're all experiencing that, albeit a little bit slower here. It's still happening. There will be an article up on the LaRouche PAC website by Tony Papper. It may already be up there, which I will refer you to. That will catch you up to date on that. But what this means is that as a new Congress comes into power in early January 2023, the most important thing is they don't really know what to do to fix this economy. And that really means that we, the American people, led by LaRouche PAC, really have to educate ourselves on the basic principles of LaRouche's economics, which address the questions of the physical economy. And so we're very grateful to have Ben joining us tonight to discuss his views on this, which of course were formed and developed by his very close working relationship with LaRouche on the questions of physical economy and frontier science. So we're going to have a little back and forth, a little discussion here to set the stage, and then open it up to discussions and participation from you. And hopefully in this discussion period, all of us will come to a better understanding of what we need to educate the incoming Congress on, and what needs to be the policies in going forward after the election. So Ben, welcome. So you sent out a pretty provocative teaser for tonight's discussion, talking about the relationship between an economic principle that LaRouche put a lot of emphasis on, energy flux density, and the Webb telescope, which picked up my ears and said this is going to be an interesting discussion. So why don't you tell us what you're talking about?
Yeah, glad to be on the discussion, Bruce. Happy to be here. You know, I think what you said about the needing to educate the new Congress coming in, you know, I think more broadly, this MAGA, America First movement that's building, that's growing, that's, you know, fighting to take back their country. I think that's the key place to start from. That's how I'm thinking about this. And, you know, one issue, so, you know, if you want to call it that, or one aspect that, you know, Americans are suffering from feeling right now, you know, is this energy policy. And,
okay.
You know, the policy is pretty simple, really. You know, we need to vastly expand our energy production. You know, from oil and gas production, get that going again, open that up again, but then really push into the frontiers of nuclear power. You know, we can get into that a little bit more. You know, I think that's pretty clear and obvious thing. A lot of people have a sense of that. Especially if we're going to talk about bringing industry back and producing things here again. You know, you're not going to do that with the current energy policy and energy infrastructure, right? But why I crafted that teaser like that is, you know, I think it's useful or really important to see that as part of a broader universal perspective. You know, this is not just an issue of human economic progress, but it's really how the universe progresses in general. And I think, you know, the American people are really suffering from the complete destruction of education and the use of education, and really brainwashing people about the real nature of the universe, the nature of man's place in the universe. And, you know, we need to get back to the idea that progress, development, change in a positive, higher energy direction is good. It's natural. And it's not just what we do, it's what the universe does as a whole. And I think the James Webb Telescope, you know, there's the first images they released led to all kinds of controversy and discussion and questions and surprises, you know, even from the most mainstream academic scientists who, you know, are operating in a very constrained ideological box, to put it lightly, had to admit that they were surprised with how organized and structured the early universe was in those pictures. They did not expect to see that galaxies were forming that quickly, that in such large galaxies and highly structured galaxies. So I just thought that was a fun, fascinating result that we got from this James Webb Telescope. There's gonna be a lot more coming from the James Webb Telescope, but that just indicates, in my view, how this is a universal principle of development and progress, and the way you can measure that, as you cited, LaRouche developed, is this metric of energy flux density.
So why don't we break that down a bit? Because that right there is really, you said you packed in a lot there. So let's start with this whole question of energy. Now, I know you've done a lot of studies when you were in the basement of the question on energy in the economy. And, LaRouche oftentimes emphasized this question of energy flux density with respect to energy in the economics of energy, and which, of course, pretty much gets throws out this whole green energy idea. But a lot of people think about this purely in money terms. Like even when they talk about the energy crisis right now, they think about the cost of energy, the cost of gasoline and the cost of heating fuel relative to the dollar. But that's not what you're talking about, right? You have there's a different way people really got to think about energy from the standpoint of the physical economy. Can you go into that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, when the economy is working properly, cost can be a relatively accurate shadow or reflection, but it's not the causal issue. It really is the physical economy. We've done some studies working with Mr. LaRouche on the history of energy throughout in the U.S. economy, throughout the history of the United States, and the transitions and the shifts. And when the economy is progressing, there's a number of ways you could measure it, look at it, but I always like looking at it in terms of having a relatively stable percentage, relatively fixed percentage of your population employed in producing energy for the economy. But the amount they're able to produce, again, when we're progressing, is increasing generation to generation, right? So the ability for your labor force to produce the energy, the electricity, the energy you need for your economy should be growing, allowing, and there, if that's happening, that's when you see, costs come down, prices come down, because your productive power, the ability for your labor force to produce higher volume and also really a higher quality of energy grows, it increases.
Well, that right there is a very important point, which I think it would help people if you could just go into it a little bit more. The difference between the volume of energy and the quality of energy, because I guess both have to increase. But what's the difference? What are you getting at there with quality and volume?
That's definitely really good. I think that's one area where Mr. LaRouche would also look at energy flux density as a measure of the quality. But I think you see it in areas like higher concentrations and intensities of energy applied allow for new manufacturing processes, new chemical processes. So it's not just just a quantity of energy per se, but it's what form the energy is in.
Would the difference between, say, heat energy, steam for heat energy, for boiling water and then using the steam versus, say, electrification?
Yeah, sure.
At the turn of the century, that's a different quality of energy. You might, if you boil the water to heat the steam to run the machines by steam power, versus heating the water to create steam to produce a turbine, which then produces electricity, which gives you the ability to run electrical machines.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's like a huge difference. I think anybody can see that, right? The difference between, because it can all be measured by units of energy, right? You can have, you measure in BTUs or You know, whatever your measure of choice is, you know, you can measure a quantity of energy. You could say this, burning this pile of leaves, you can produce the same amount of energy as the amount of energy flowing through, you know, a power cable over a certain amount of time, right? But those are wildly different in terms of what you can do with them and the quality of them. But there was a couple of people that did a study in the 80s under LaRouche's direction that looked at even just thermal or heat energy itself. They looked at the history of iron and steel production throughout the history of the United States, and they showed that as the furnaces got operated at higher temperatures, higher concentrations of energy, higher levels of energy flux density, where you're literally measuring the energy throughput per volume per time, right? How much energy is concentrated and is being utilized in these furnaces to produce iron and steel, which is a huge part of the economy, right? I think it's by weight, it's the most used element of the whole periodic table, iron, for any economy globally. So it's a huge part of the economy. You could directly measure the increase in productivity in terms of how many tons does each operative at the plant put out per year. Just very simple measures of productive output directly reflects the increases of the energy concentrations. So you had technological changes, right? You had blast furnaces, you had the introduction of direct blasting of pure oxygen into the furnace to get higher temperatures. So you have these kind of different technological innovations, right? Each one is unique, each one is different, but there's a certain continuity in the metric of the increasing energy flux density. That whatever, you know, new technologies came about, it was always associated, if it led to higher productivities, it was always associated with higher levels of energy concentration, energy flux density. So the quality of the energy utilized in terms of the ability to produce what you're trying to get done, is directly measured by that. And I thought that was a fascinating study.
Now, on this question of energy flux density, there was also a study which I know was done early on back in the 70s, I think, by LaRouche's economics team, but I think you participated in some of the elaboration on it, which I think would be good to go over for people, that talked about energy flux density with just respect to the types of generation of energy progressively, which really puts to rest the stupidity of relying on wind and solar and so forth. Can you talk about that? I think people will benefit if they really understood that.
Yeah, you mean like the sources where we're
the sources of energy, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and we looked at that. I think 2010 or so. I think we did a study where we looked at the history of the United States, and you know, early on, what was the primary fuel source? It was wood, right? Wood, charcoal, which is a product of wood. You know, basically biomass, burning biomass. That was your primary source of energy until you had the introduction of coal, the discovery of coal and the ability to utilize coal. And then into oil and natural gas, you know, so-called, that whole class of so-called fossil fuels. And then really into nuclear, you had hydropower in there, which is kind of an interesting case too. But you see very clearly a few things. One, what you call the energy density of the fuels increases. So how much energy is available per weight of the fuel, right? Mm-hmm. So to have, you know, I wish I had we have some illustrations in terms of actual examples, but I don't have those offhand. But you know, the certain weight of wood will give you a certain amount of energy produced, but the equivalent amount of energy produced from coal is far less total weight of the fuel, right? You get a lot more energy per weight of the fuel. Mm-hmm. And then oil and natural gas is even more energy dense than coal, and then nuclear fission and then fusion are just then orders of magnitude even more powerful. So you see this clear progression in terms of increasing energy density of the fuel sources, which, technologies to generate, to use those in mass in the economy are developed off of these fuel sources. But then you also see the per capita, per person total energy use increasing consistently as we move up the chain to these more energy dense fuels, more advanced fuels.
Mhm.
So it's a really fascinating study. You kind of see these like waves of energy use as you go from wood and biomass to coal to petroleum and natural gas. And then, what we started to see with nuclear, you just see this stepwise succession of like nested waves of increasing energy density of the fuel source, but then increasing energy consumption and energy consumption per capita for the economy as a whole, which can also be, if you're talking about the economy in its entirety, you can view that, I view that as a metric of energy flux density for the economy as a whole also. What's the average energy consumption per person in the economy, assuming it's being used productively and it's a healthy economy and all that. You can just look at that as a measure of the energy flux density of the economy as an entirety, as a unit. And you see that, again, progress, development, increasing standards of living, increasing quality of life, increased life expectancy. All these things go up in direct relation to the increasing energy flux density. A couple of years ago, now I did a study where I looked at economies globally, nations all around the world, and that was just universally the case. You look at any nation that's developed. Many nations, obviously, look at nations that have gone through major development, like in the last couple generations, like China, or like, South Korea is another interesting example, or, nations that have gone through major progress from, so-called third world or lesser developed nation to a more advanced nation, always can be measured by the increasing energy flux density of that economy as a totality. So, it's really a key metric. And then, like you said, it really gives a better perspective for understanding why all this green stuff is crazy, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, on the studies that you've done and charts, maybe what we can do just for our audience is when we do post this on the website, we can post links to some of those studies or the charts so that for those of you who want to see that, they'll be made available when this is posted up on the website.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the green energy, how does that compare? I think it might be obvious, but it's probably worth making it explicit in terms of the, I guess the two main green energy sources that everybody talks about is solar and wind. Right. So, but they're far less energy flux density, right? The maximum solar energy is the density of the solar rays hitting the Earth's surface, which is a fixed maximum, but no mechanical device is going to be able to convert that entire amount of energy. But even if you could, it would be far less energy dense than even wood and charcoal, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the, no matter exactly like you said, no matter how you cut it, whatever technology you develop, your technology could be the most advanced ever. You're not changing the fundamental source you're going to, right? Which is the wind or the sunlight. And that's a fixed energy density. There's only so much, for sunlight, there's only so much sunlight hitting a square foot or whatever you want to measure it by. That's a fixed amount. So, and it's not very much, it's not very much at all. That's why we can go walk outside and, maybe you'll get a little sunburn or something, but it's not, it's not a huge amount of energy So you got to build very large apparatuses, very large solar arrays covering huge land footprints to gather a decent amount of energy. So, I forget which one of the national labs did an interesting study, which I really liked, where they looked at the material cost, because you got to build all
my
those
next question, yeah.
yeah, you got to build all those solar panels, and those require glass and ceramics and metals. And so if you look at energy produced per raw material input, it's wild. Like wind and solar are so much more than any other source. So you got to just build tons of these giant windmills. These things are huge monstrosities. Tons of steel to build the poles they're on, and fiberglass and other advanced materials, and all that takes energy to produce those, right? But so the amount of total steel and glass and cement and concrete, all the inputs per amount of energy you get out of it is like orders of magnitude higher for wind and solar. So it's just incredibly inefficient, right? It's definitely going backwards, because we just, and that translates to cost, right? If it takes way more raw materials and labor and production to go into producing the same amount of energy you had before, your costs are going to go up.
Right.
It's hard to get around that, and that's what we're doing now.
And it's not very renewable, because you have to use up a lot of raw materials, some of which are not so abundant,
right?
To produce these devices.
Right.
When those materials could be better used in more advanced technologies.
Right.
And of course, then you have the problem that, these don't work when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. So you have to use batteries to store the energy. The
right.
batteries then require even more energy dense, more employment of or use of energy and raw materials and so forth to produce the batteries. Right. And in fact, I can just add this, that I know that I think the total amount of fossil fuel energy that has been replaced to date by solar and wind and whatever other things they might call renewables is like 1%. And it's already created huge energy shortages everywhere these things have been adopted. I mean, we know it here, but look at Germany, for example, which has abundance of coal and was one of the biggest biggest countries relying on nuclear power, and they shut down the nuclear power for no reason whatsoever, other than after the Fukushima accident, which had nothing to do with, first of all, was handled very well by the Japanese, and secondly, was no threat to Germany, but they shut down all their nuclear plants. Ironically, the Green Party, which led the fight for shutting down the nuclear plants, which was then adopted by Angela Merkel, who was a Christian Democrat, so-called conservative. The Green Party today holds the foreign ministry post, and they're some of the most biggest warmongers, pushing for war and sanctions against Russia, which is the major supplier of fossil fuel energies, as people know, to Germany. And in the United States, I think there's a nuclear plant coming online in Georgia. Is it Georgia? That was the first plant in like 25 years that's been, or more, online.
Yeah, in the Tennessee Valley area, I think, right?
Right.
Yeah. No, yeah, we definitely, the policy is clear. I think a lot of people are realizing this. We need, like, nuclear is just the next natural step, and we've been really killing ourselves, killing our economy by not developing that en masse. But what I find fascinating is that this is not, it's not just something you see in human economies. You look at the history of life on Earth.
Yeah, this I wanted to ask you about. Go ahead. This is
Yeah,
important.
we did some studies on this with Mr. LaRouche. You know, he was fascinated by this subject, and you look at it, and you know, it's a difficult area to study because you know, you're looking at fossils, and you know, you have like a small snapshot of what the, you know, life used to look like in the past. But you know, through all these different ways, you know, you can begin to hints to get a sense of what life used to be like millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. You see this, all kinds of lines of evidence pointing to increasing energy flux density of individual organisms and species and the biosphere as a whole. That, you know, that there is a very clear progress and direction in evolution, and it's measured, it can measure it very simply and clearly by increasing energy flux density as well.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? Give us some examples.
Yeah, like, as you know, everyone's familiar with the dinosaurs, right? You know, as the precursor to the mammalian age and the age of mammals, you know, just as you can roughly define, you know, life at that stage, you know, before 65 million years ago, before you had this mass extinction and the emergence of the mammals, the dinosaurs, but also other forms of life, the plant life at the time, other ocean life at the time, was all characterized by lower metabolic rates, lower energy consumption, lower energy concentration of the plant matter that's produced, you know, which is like the basis of the whole biosphere, right? The photosynthesis and the production of plant life, everything builds off that, you know. Herbivores eat the plants and carnivores eat the herbivores, and that's how you build up your whole biosphere off of the role of the plants in converting the sunlight. So even the baseline plants at the time, you know, you had lower levels of energy concentration, energy production. So the whole system, you know, the organisms in the system, the species at the time, but the biospheric system as a whole was just overall a lower level of energy throughput, energy consumption, rate of energy transfer. And you see that if you go back further, before the time of the dinosaurs, you know, what, I don't know if this is the correct academic term, but like an age when you had more amphibian type life, kind of characterizing the more advanced, highest forms of life at the time. You know, you see again lower levels of energy flux density, energy concentration. So it really is a fascinating, you know, metric you can use, and I view it as, and I think this is how Mr. LaRouche viewed it too. You know, it's just a metric. It's a shadow of an inherent directionality of creative development, creative progress. You know, that's why I think energy flux density is such an important metric to look at. It's not, you know, but it's a shadow. It's an indication of something else, that the universe is organized towards development, towards progress. You know, we talked about human societies, we talked about the history of life, but people have shown, you see this even on astronomical scales. You see this as stars are formed and develop and go through the process of producing the periodic table, producing the elements, the higher, heavier elements that, you know, all of life and everything we know of depends upon. You know, our understanding is that this is all produced by stars in kind of a productive process in a certain way. That the life cycles and the evolutions of stars you can measure as increasing energy flux density as stars develop and go through their life cycles, and even galaxies as a whole, even the development of galactic systems, you know, which makes sense because they're composed of stars. But, you know, you really see this throughout, that as systems develop and evolve and change, it's not just, you know, change one way or change the other way. It's changing in a certain direction, changing in terms of increasing complexity, increasing development, increasing potential. more generally a creative process. And energy flux density is kind of a consistent metric you can really take, throughout these widely different systems, from entire galactic systems to stars, to the history of life on Earth, to human societies. It's just a fascinating study, just to kind of take this lens and apply it in all these different areas and see how applicable it is.
So it's an indicator of progress in a sense. It's not the cause of the progress, but it's an effect which can be measured that indicates that you're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. So progressives who support going to lower energy flux densities are not progressives, they're regressives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah.
They're regressing to a previous state, which is, of course, since evolution and all these things that you described are all going in one direction, there is, I get for sure, resistance. The universe will resist being pushed in a regressive direction, right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't see it, right? The evolution of life didn't go from, a higher energy state system to a lower. It's always going to higher and higher states.
Right? So if you're trying to push the human economy, and I guess including with these environmentalists, they want to, they always want to shut down progress in order to protect lower forms of life.
Right.
So you're trying to increase the dominance of lower forms of life over higher forms of life, and you're in doing that, you're actually working against nature, because nature wants to go the other way, from what your studies show.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. They say they're environmentalists, but they're against what the environment's been doing.
Right. Human beings are natural, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Part of nature.
And it also goes, and I think, a lot of our audience, I'm sure, has come to their own similar views of how crazy this green or Malthusian, anti-progress movement is. But I think it also provides really important perspective for, we might say more some of the conservative discussion, where you have this kind of persistent problematic view that we shouldn't be laissez-faire, we shouldn't be intervening in the economy, we should just be letting, you can't have a sense of that progress just comes from letting everyone do their thing, and it's not something you can actually understand or predict or try and make occur. It's the famous, Mr. LaRouche always liked these quotes from Adam Smith, and Adam Smith's, some of the ideological origins of this kind of free trade economic theory, where he was very clear. It's just let people pursue their pleasures and avoid pain, and that's all you should think about. That's all people should do, and then the economy will progress and things will be great just doing that, right? And you're saying don't try and conceptualize what's going to make the economy better as a whole, or what progress looks like. The economy should just be people just seeking their own individual pleasure and avoiding the pain that they can avoid, and progress is going to come out of that, which is a crazy worldview. If you look at the kind of stuff we're discussing, you can see a clear idea as to where progress, what the next stages of progress are, and where we should be shooting towards. It doesn't mean that we should be having a top-down controlled economy to force all that to happen, but we also shouldn't pretend that we don't know that nuclear power and fusion power is the frontier, is the future of human society on this planet and beyond, and we should be figuring out the best ways to pursue that as rapidly as possible.
And fossil fuels is the present. I mean, we have huge amounts of fossil fuels and coal, And it's absolutely insane to cut back or try and limit fossil fuels and the use of fossil fuels and the production of fossil fuels, which limits the progress, limits your ability to make progress into higher energy flux density.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think people really understand. I mean, how much of our infrastructure is built around this, you know? I mean, it's so much, you know, you just think about cars to power plants to, you know, pipe systems to, I mean, this just permeates. So much of our economy is built on this. You know, it's going to take a long, you know, it's going to take a major period to transition that, and we need to transition it to higher forms, but we need to utilize it, you know, at higher rates now to help us get there. And, you know, obviously the whole climate change is a whole nother subject, you know, that I don't know if we want to get all into, but that's.
Well, I was just about to ask you, because that's the argument that's used to limit fossil fuels, of course, is the argument that we have to stop carbon into the atmosphere because it's burning up the earth is burning up. If you listen to AOC or Greta
Right.
Thunberg or some of these crazies, you know, and every hurricane is caused by global warming, even though there were some pretty serious bad hurricanes 100 years ago, and just as many as there are now.
Yeah.
I mean, the evidence is pretty much against global warming. You might want to go into that just a little bit, because the propaganda is so thick, and it's, you know, it's been adopted by governments, it's been adopted by the UN, the EU, all the globalists. The idea that somehow ending fossil fuels or limiting fossil fuel consumption is, you know, an urgent matter for mankind, when it's exactly the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, that's obviously a huge subject. You know, we could have multiple discussions just on that, you know, but I think just a couple of points. I mean, one, if you look at the long-term climate history of the Earth, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and global temperature don't correlate consistently throughout history. You know, on long time scales, you get periods when carbon emissions are going up and global temperatures are going down. You have periods where it's the inverse. So there's no real evidence that CO2 is, you know, I guess what people might call a primary driver. You know, it's a component. The greenhouse effect is a real effect. You know, it's part of the system, but it's a highly, highly complex system. You know, and the question is, you know, how big of an impact does it have? And, you know, just the historical climatological record of the history of the planet doesn't lead you to believe that CO2 is a primary main driver of the climate system. You know, it's really much more astronomical phenomenon seem to be, you know, what the sun's doing, but also potentially where we're located in the galaxy and all kinds of fascinating interactions there. You know, there's a relatively recent study by Professor William Happer out of Princeton, who's a high-level physicist, and his work seems to show that you know, the greenhouse effect, you know, the idea is, you know, the sunlight comes in, interacts with the Earth's surface, warms up the Earth to a certain degree, and then the Earth re-radiates, you know, infrared radiation as a product of that. So the wavelengths coming in is different than the wavelengths coming out, and the wavelengths coming out, you know, get captured by greenhouse gases. Well, there's only so much radiation coming back out. It's limited. It's not an infinite source of added energy to the system. There's certain parts of the spectrum of infrared radiation that's re-radiating from the Earth that can get captured by the different greenhouse gases. And his work shows that it seems to be we've almost completely saturated that effect. That any global warming attributable to increased concentration of greenhouse gases seems to have already occurred. And if we keep increasing the greenhouse gases, you're going to see less and less and less and less of an effect in terms of warming from the higher concentrations of gases. Really fascinating study. And that seems to correspond very well with the fact that we have not been seeing the warming that all these models have been claiming is going to happen. So if you look at, claims that were made in the 90s or the late 90s or the early 2000s, and they were saying, if we don't stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere, we're going to get this much warming and things are going to, all be horrific and crazy. And this is what our models are showing us. But if you look at what's happened, like in the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and you compare that with what the climate models say should happen as a function of the, increased CO2 that's been put in the air, it's wildly different. We're not seeing the warming that these models have been claiming would happen. And that's well known, it's an open subject of discussion. People say these models are running hot. They're forecasting more warming than we're seeing. If you look at satellite measurements, the global average temperature has kind of been pretty stable the last decade, 15 years or so. It goes up and down, but there hasn't been a major upward trend. Some people call this the global warming pause. There's, from the direct observational evidence, we're not seeing the warming that people have been claiming would happen as a function of how much CO2 we're putting in the air. And then on the theoretical side, I just think this study by Professor Happer is really an interesting insight, because he's saying that, look, we've probably already saturated the effect. So, if we keep dumping more CO2, you're not going to, so you're talking about maybe like a 1 degree, maybe a little bit more overall impact we might have had. And even that's probably, subject of debate and discussion and high levels of complexity. But, to the degree that's a real effect, it's already happened. And, despite, like you said, despite what crazy people say, and most scientists don't even argue this, we're seeing storms now like we've been seeing storms for the past 100 years, right? There's no clear evidence. Politicians like to say this and news media like to say this, but there's no solid scientific evidence that we're seeing more extreme weather now by any means. And no serious scientist is making that argument now. Some of them are saying, our models are saying that's going to happen in 50 years or 100 years, but that's all hypothetical, right? No serious scientist is saying what we're seeing now is some crazy, wild change from what we've been seeing the past 100 years or historical records.
Right. And whatever happens, it's going to happen over a long period of time. So there's plenty of time for man to adjust and conquer whatever the implications are.
Right.
You say there's an open discussion. This is openly known. Of course, it hasn't been allowed to be openly discussed on Twitter, or maybe that'll change with Elon taking it over.
Right.
And I think this is one of the other things that's fueling the reaction in the public. We've just been beaten over the head with this follow the science, and what people are being told is science is so patently absurd. You don't even need to be a scientist to know how stupid it is.
Right.
And what you're presenting and what we have to present is real science. And I think we've come to a point in society, in our history, where really people have to have the courage to stand up and say the truth and not cower under what the politically correct hysteria. Right. So we have one person in the queue. Why don't we start opening it up for